Hello, everyone. In this video, I'm going to be talking about behavioral and cognitive behavioral family counseling, experiential family counseling theory, and structural family counseling theory. So I'm drawing from the Gladding 2019 text on family work, as well as some video demonstrations from various key figures in these approaches. So for each of these theories, I'm going to be kind of talking about how does the counselor conceptualize what's happening according to that theory. You know, what is the process that's occurring, or what should occur, and what's the emphasis of the theory, and then go into some of the interventions and techniques, and then just kind of the role of the counselor. All right, so the first one, the behavioral and cognitive behavioral family counseling. So overall, the idea is that learning is emphasized, learning theory. And so if new behaviors can be learned, then emotional changes can occur, you know, as well as, you know, belief systems can shift. And the idea, particularly in the systems approach to working with a behavioral, cognitive behavioral family, you know, theory, is that, you know, if one or even several members change their behaviors, then that'll start to disrupt the family system, and hopefully disrupt it in a positive way, you know, to kind of disrupt some of those negative patterns. And specifically emphasizing the cognitive behavioral family theory approach. So if thoughts and beliefs can change or be relearned, then emotions will change for the better. You know, then behaviors will change. So it's kind of like, where's kind of the emphasis for the counselor that'll kind of start to spark movement forward. So for cognitive behavioral, it's going to be on those belief systems. And the counselor is going to be looking for, what are those relationship related cognitions, beliefs. So for example, someone might say, you know, people in my family hate me if they get mad at me. Maybe that's the belief system. Maybe that's conscious, maybe it's unconscious. So the counselor might help them rework that belief system, that if someone, you know, is mad at me, then that means they hate me. So a reshift in that belief is sometimes family members get upset and they can still care for me. So that flexibility in that belief system of not kind of overgeneralizing and kind of jumping to conclusions would be important to kind of reorient and rework. I think an important piece of this is that, you know, emotions are still addressed in this approach, although from my perspective, they're not necessarily seen as central, but, you know, they're important in attending to the emotional reactions of the client family, as a way to kind of build rapport, build a relationship. You know, and sometimes this approach can also be kind of skill training. So in the Gladding text, he talks about, you know, how sometimes a behavioral or a cognitive behavioral approach can be used with working with clients who are experiencing sexual dysfunctions or parent skills, parent difficulties. So parenting children training can be important. So some of the techniques, I guess I just described education. Also, psychoeducation can be an important piece of this. This isn't an exhaustive list, but just some of those some ideas that are pretty central to the cognitive behavioral and the behavioral approaches will be emphasized. So contracting or contingency contracting can be important. So this might look like, you know, kind of having like a graph of like, okay, so if you get so many stars, then you get this positive reward. So once again, it's pretty behavioral based on that learning theory. But, you know, so a counselor might work with parents or caregivers to work with the children in the family to like kind of set up one of these contracts or these plans to be able to say, you know, to try to reinforce positive behaviors, they can have this point system to then have a positive reward. And that kind of leads to classical conditioning, this idea of trying to reinforce positive behaviors. You know, so if the child puts away their dishes, you know, the parent could reinforce that by, you know, giving them a small treat or just giving them praise or whatever it is. But the idea is, you know, how can I condition some of these more constructive behaviors that the family is looking for? Let's see, shaping kind of goes along with classical conditioning and just kind of these behavioral learning styles. But shaping is like basically, how can you take gradual steps towards the goal behavior? So for example, if a parent was potty training, you know, like how could the parent gradually kind of help the child move towards going to the bathroom on the toilet? It might first be like just noticing when they need to go to the bathroom. The next step could be then going to the, like walking into the bathroom while they still have a diaper on, but still kind of moving slowly towards the toilet, then, sitting on the toilet when they go to the bathroom, then kind of getting used to, going to the bathroom fully on the toilet, so those gradual steps. And I think that's the example that Gladden used in his text of like some of those small steps towards body training as a way of shaping that desired behavior. I think one of the key approaches or key techniques in this approach is disputing irrational thoughts, irrational beliefs. So the ABC model might often be used. If you've taken counseling theories, general counseling theories, you've probably learned about this already. But with the family system, you might work on those, individual members and their belief systems, and even some of what are some of the system belief systems that are maybe, irrational beliefs. So the idea, though, is that, first you have some sort of activating event. That's what the A stands for in ABC. So there's an activating event, and then usually there's an emotional consequence. So that's the C. But what's been between the A and the C, that consequence, is the belief, B. So an activating event then leads to a belief, which then leads to an emotional consequence. So for example, if a spouse comes home late at night, later than they're supposed to, that might be an activating event where the other partner feels angry. But then the belief system to kind of dissect is important of like, why are they angry? Maybe it's like, oh, the belief is maybe they weren't being loyal to me. Maybe I can't trust them if they don't show up late. Maybe they're off doing things, with someone else, so they're not being loyal to me. So reworking some of those belief systems with the family or the couple could be really important. If like, okay, maybe I can, instead of jumping to that conclusion that they're not being loyal, maybe it's, okay, I'm concerned and I need to talk to them about it. So kind of trying to rework the kind of jumping to some of those conclusions can be important. Just kind of a quick example there. So some of my thoughts on just like the personhood of the counselor coming from this behavioral or cognitive behavioral approach. Usually the counselor is seen as kind of the expert in this approach, or a teacher. They might be a collaborator or kind of a coach who coaches the family on how to kind of move towards more constructive behaviors or belief systems. And I think a video demonstration that's on psychotherapy.net by Richard Stewart is a pretty good example of this. He really emphasizes the focus on behavioral change when working with a couple. He kind of helps them also kind of model behavior or act as if is another technique of like, kind of like, if you were to act loving towards each other, how would you be acting? And then the idea is like, okay, start acting that way then. But yeah, he also, interestingly enough, kind of uses quite a bit of self-disclosure and stories from his personal life, which would likely kind of lead back into the teaching role or the modeling of potential behavior for the family. So that's a little bit of just the personhood of the counselor. Now I'm going to shift to experiential family counseling theory. So in this approach, affect is really, really emphasized. Emotional expression and awareness is really, really important. It's really central to this approach. And the role, like the counselor basically is helping to set up an emotion, or excuse me, kind of like more an environmental condition or space for the family to experience together, where they feel like a sense of nurturance, or they feel some warmth, where they can be genuine, or the counselor's genuine with them, where they feel like a feeling of respect. So it's almost like a cocoon or a womb. Whitaker talked about, the experiential space being kind of like a womb type experience. So that can, so there are these conditions, kind of similar to person-centered theory in my experience, or humanistic counseling theory. That once again, those conditions in the counseling space then lead to natural growth and development, because that's really what counseling is about. It's not to be like progressing towards a specific goal. It's really to be, growing and developing into your best self, your better self, kind of that self-actualization. So it's very process focused, and Whitaker also talked about it, that it's process focused rather than progress focused. So like specific changes and specific plans aren't really talked about, because the present moment is what's being emphasized, the process of the present moment. So it's almost like if right now can shift, if we can experience a new way of being right now with the family, that is the work that will translate outward. Let's see. And Virginia Satir kind of talked about, some stages, or I guess just three to kind of make sense of, what it could look like. Is the first is just kind of making contact with the family, like kind of developing rapport, getting to understand their story, getting to making contact with each member of the family unit that's there. But then it'll start to shift, the more that the relationships develop into a state of chaos, where once again, the dynamics that brought them in will begin to be experienced in the present moment. So then, that chaos is really central, because you're experientially working on the dynamics that need to shift and change for the family in the moment. So then, through that chaos, then the family will begin to experience each other in a new way. And I'll talk about some of the techniques and interventions of how that shift occurs in a moment. But then, those new ways of being are then integrated into the family system until they're ready to be done. And I kind of see this as an inside out change process. So there's a lot is focused on the emotional expression, emotional awareness, and then how to use your whole self, your whole emotional self in your relationships, so that you can be whole as a person, but then the system can be more whole as well. So some of the interventions by the experiential family counselor, once again, not an exhaustive list. And Virginia Satir and Carl Whitaker are the two main figures who really are foundational to this approach, but they're very different at the same time. So watching demonstration videos of them is really important to kind of see the uniqueness. But I think in the end, they're both facilitating a very emotional experience, an emotional experience that's kind of transformative in the sense that it's shifting the family dynamic in the present moment. But I think some things that Virginia Satir does in particular is kind of trying out new behaviors in the moment. So she would work with the family and maybe just instead of talking about changes outside of the session, she would just kind of have two members of the family come closer together and just talk right to each other in a new way. And she'd kind of coach them along, maybe coaching them to express their feelings, or expressing them, or helping them to use I statements, so they're saying, instead of saying, you do this, which can come across as in a blaming way, she kind of coached them, how can they use I statements? I feel this way when you do this. So it's kind of trying to own their own experience instead of blaming. In the end, that can be kind of the affective confrontation can be a big part of this approach, so really honoring the emotional reactions in the family and helping them confront them together, express them more openly, so that they're not holding back and only being shells of their true self, but bring their whole self to the family unit. Satir also talked about, the family members might be playing different roles. Maybe there's a blamer in the family, once again, who's their go-to in conflict or when they're feeling vulnerable is to blame. There could be a placater. So the placater is the one who's usually willing to kind of throw themselves under the bus to keep the peace. So basically, at any cost, how can I help keep the peace? How can I kind of have the conflict end? It could be a distractor. So if the conflict starts to emerge or emotions are being expressed, they might try to change the topic, or maybe use humor to kind of completely change the focus of what's occurring. Then another role might be the computer, is what Satir talks about. Someone who just overly rationalizes, just trying to overly be cognitive and not being willing to kind of enter that emotional space. A couple last interventions that, once again, not the exhaustive list, but just kind of some uniqueness, is this idea of sculpting, where Satir would maybe talk about, how can I use maybe a member of the family to be the sculptor, and they place members in the family around the room to kind of recreate maybe a dynamic or a situation in the family, like maybe a situation where there's been conflict or where there's an argument. One member of the family sculpts that, so it's visually represented. Then you can start to process, okay, why are certain members next to each other? Why are other members farther away? Maybe there's one member in the corner far away. So that processing starts to allow those dynamics that occur elsewhere to be brought back into the present moment and be worked on. I think one thing that's interesting about Satir, and I guess I keep bringing up Satir, but I'll talk about Whitaker in a little bit as well, but she uses touch quite a bit. She would be really close to the family. She's really like kind of charismatic, but just really emotionally present with the family. But yeah, if you have, I'd encourage you to watch the demonstration video of Satir to be able to kind of see how she uses touch and your reactions to touch. I sometimes, like, I'm not always a super touchy person. So it was interesting to observe that and see how that might actually be helpful, but it kind of depends on the unit. It depends on the trust levels. Overall, though, I think the personhood of the counselor, who the counselor is with the family, is more of a facilitator. They're trying to be their own whole person with the family. They're genuine. They're just trying to be themselves. And I think the key is also there's not as much structure. There's not a clear pathway of here's what needs, like a linear progression. It's, once again, the emphasis is on process, being present in the moment with the family to experience that shift. Let's see. So I want to emphasize Carl Whitaker really quick. So when the video of him demonstrating his approach is pretty interesting. A lot came up for me when I was observing him, because he was working with a family, and he would often kind of throw out kind of absurd comments. He'd just kind of say, I just had kind of a crazy thought, and he'd throw it out there to them. And he would kind of almost be provoking the family. And it's really interesting to see, like, I think first off, my first reaction was, what is he doing? Why is he doing that? But then he talks about the reason why. So I'd like you to, consider, like, once again, not provoking, but he used provocative statements to kind of like take things to extreme for the family. And I think, once again, like, he even said, like, to the son, do you think your dad could ever kill someone in the family if he got really mad? Because they're talking about the anger of the dad. So he would take things pretty far to kind of almost to like go to an extreme. So then it frees the family to talk about really whatever. I think he was really about freedom and letting people emotionally express whatever's in their experience. But it can be kind of uncomfortable. It can be kind of unique. I think his approach is not the norm nowadays in particular. He'd also use self-disclosure. Like the father in the family talked about, an attempted suicide. Whitaker talked about how he had attempted suicide. He also uses gender dynamics and gender language in a lot of his interventions. So I'd encourage you to think about, your reactions to some of that language and how that, I don't know, just being attuned to what are your thoughts on that? What are your feelings on that? I think can be important. All right, for time's sake, I could talk for a while on that one, but for time's sake, I'm going to shift to the structural family counseling approach. So the structural family counseling approach is, I'm going to use the word structure about 1 million times for this approach, because that's the central concept, though. So the idea is, like, how can the family counselor understand what is the structure of the family, and then how do they need to restructure? So, and structure is defined in the Gladding text. It's on page 292, but he's actually just quoting Salvador Minuchin. But so structure is an invisible set of functional demands that organizes the ways in which family members interact. So once again, those invisible roles, patterns, themes, dynamics that kind of come together as, like, okay, here's how our family functions. So the family counselor from the structural approach will be focusing on, what's the structure of the whole unit, but what also are those subunits? Maybe there's coalitions. So there could, some of those coalitions or those subsystems could be like the spousal, or so how are the spouses or the partners coming together? What's that unit like? What are the rules in that relationship? What are the power dynamics in that relationship? There could be like parental. So how do the parents kind of come together to parent the children? What are those rules? What are those patterns? Does one parent kind of take the lead in caregiving, and one's kind of not as present, or are they both kind of together, complementing one another? Also, there could be sibling coalitions or subsystems. What are the dynamics among the siblings, but I think the coalitions can also be maybe a parent and a child have a really strong attachment, maybe in kind of being enmeshed in a relationship. So they've kind of formed like a dynamic and a coalition in the family unit that then the others members of the family are trying to make sense of because they have this really strong connection, but others are isolated from that. So once again, I guess my ideas here is just trying to get you to think of what is the structure, what is the organization, how does the family organize itself to function? Boundaries is an important piece to consider too. So the guiding text talks about the boundaries as well. So the boundaries might be clear. Maybe they're known, they're understood, they're respected. There's a kind of a give and take of, not being over involved, but not being, emotionally distanced. Like there's enough where I can be my own person, but still be connected, kind of like differentiation from Bowenian theory. But sometimes boundaries are really rigid. So it's like saying, nope, here are my boundaries, you can't cross it. Like it's not like a permeable membrane that certain things can come through when it's like a clear boundary, but rigid would be like, nope, back off. So it's almost like really cut off from one another, distant, and you can't reach certain pieces of who I am. There's boundaries that are just closed. It's like a stone wall. Then diffused boundaries would be like there's no clear boundary at all. So people are just really over involved and they like are really dependent upon one another. They can't make their own decisions. So in the end, the structural family counselor would really just be using these ideas and concepts to conceptualize, what's the structure of the organization of the family? What are the roles, rules, and power? On page 295 of the Gladden text, it talks about those elements. So some of the techniques that the structural family counselor might use is joining. So first off, building that rapport with each member, demonstrating empathy towards each member is really important. Kind of establishing that safe environment is essential to kind of be able to kind of join in with the family structure and be able to see it. They'll also like really early on just do a lot of tracking, just kind of tracking the content, not to stay superficial, but just to kind of hear out the story of the family. But then it's allowing the counselor to be able to kind of start to notice what are some entry points into seeing the structure of the family. So, but they wouldn't really share what those deeper dynamics about the roles, the rules, the boundaries yet. They would just kind of hear the story and start to notice what are those entry points into being able to address that later. So some of the Glading talks about mimesis. And that kind of has to do with, the structural counselor wants to kind of enter into the organizational patterns of the family. So, if there's communication patterns, different family members, maybe one kind of talks and is loud and laughing. So the counselor would kind of try to join in with that, have a similar communication pattern with that individual. If one is kind of quiet, talks quiet, slow, the counselor would want to match that. So this matching is important for the family counselor as well. I think, a key technique in structural family counseling is also reframing. And I think that's the point where the family counselor can use some of those entry points of like, okay, so how can I address clear boundaries? Like maybe the structural family counselor is noticing that there's really diffuse boundaries, that members get really over involved, or maybe a coalition in the family gets really over involved. So they might say, yeah, there's almost like this, there's a team in the family. This parent and this child, they're a team, but they share every single detail and they can't really function without each other. So they'd start to reframe that as having a diffused boundary that they can't kind of separate enough. So that would be ways of, using reframing to highlight the structure of the family and kind of start to provide some new ways of viewing the family structure, to maybe shift and restructure towards a new way that might be more healthy for the family and helpful to the family. Another idea is this idea of unbalancing. So maybe there's almost like a scapegoat member of the family, someone who's kind of removed and is maybe kind of distant or isolated from the family. The structural family counselor might kind of join in specifically with that member of the family to kind of try to find new balance, to bring them in and have their experience honored as much as everyone else's in the family. So this kind of has to do with the ideas of power in the family. Maybe some individuals have less power, so kind of joining with them, the counselor can join with them to kind of help increase their sense of power in the family unit. So probably just two last ideas is on the intervention is to make those boundaries visible and conscious, make those rules and those roles, visible and conscious. So that's really what the structural family counselor is doing, is bring that organization of what's happening in the family. What are these teams, these partnerships, these coalitions, these subunits, kind of bring that to the surface so then it can be reorganized, redeveloped, reconsidered, restructured. And let's see. So I guess who the counselor is, their role, according to this approach, is kind of like so Gladden kind of talked about basically that one role is an observer, observing the dynamics, and then being able to share those dynamics back to the family. Because oftentimes getting the insight into what is the structure of the family, if that's been unconscious for so long, making that conscious can be a pretty transformative and process. It can change how the family functions just to be aware of what is actually happening underneath the surface. When those are brought to the surface, that can really shift a lot. But the counselor is also somewhat of an expert, because they're kind of almost not as much teaching, but they're the expert who can see into these dynamics. It's kind of how they view their role. So they might initially be the leader, be the expert, but then they start to kind of shift towards just the observer and kind of helping the family make sense of those dynamics. And then they might be helping just as a facilitator for the family to then, how do I reintegrate the awareness now that we have of the structure of our family into a new structure that's more beneficial to us. So Harry Aponte did a demonstration video with the family as well. And some of the really interesting things that he did was, he highlighted, so basically what brought the family in was there's a child in the family who was crying a lot, also kind of experiencing night terrors, basically, which is when you're like sleepwalking, but sometimes you might just be screaming or running around. And the family was pretty concerned about this. They came in, but what came up is that there's this structure in the family to where, there's just a lot of kind of chaos and disorganization and mixed messages. There'd be like three, I guess the video is called Tres Madres. So there'd be three mothers almost to this child. So they're in a multi-generational family structure. So the mom was 24 of the child, but then the grandmother was actually doing much of the parenting, because the mother is often off working or even living elsewhere to try to kind of develop their own family system. And even the great grandmother was part of the parenting too. So just noticing and naming that structure, and then working within those subunits, of the mother-daughter relationship, of the mother grandmother relationship, of the mother great grandmother relationship, and then there is a partner as well, working on the couple relationship. Those are different subunits that were all part of this whole system, this whole structure, that all needed attending to. So as the different subunits were addressed, then that would start to hopefully bring more peace and more a healthier restructuring to the family unit as a whole. So yeah, those are just some of the thoughts on these three theories. But yeah, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on this. And there's the three. Look forward to talking more.